evening, everybody. This is Michael Tabman, and welcome to Crimes and Times. Tonight, we're going to talk about lying, spying, and politicizing. And we have a journalist with some expertise in this area, at least with his opinion and some of the work he's done, who's going to join us for the conversation. Let us introduce John Greenberg, who is a staff writer with Politifact. He was a part of the Politifact team during the 2012 presidential election and was one of the fact-checkers who launched Politifact in 2013. Prior to that, he was executive director at New Hampshire Public Radio and a Washington reporter for National Public Radio. He has twice won awards from the Society of Professional Journalists for investigative reporting. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Hey, before we get started, tell us a little bit about those awards you won. That sounds like you did some pretty good work. What were you doing on those cases, if you don't mind sharing with the audience?
Oh, nope. And basically one was for some ethics investigative work that we did at New Hampshire Public Radio. And what we had was a governor and a Speaker of the House who were playing fast and loose with their relationships with their business partners. And we simply drew the public's attention to it, and the voters of New Hampshire ate it up, and it was a real nice contribution to make. Ethics are important, and the residents of the state agreed with us. And the other one happened to do with a very strange turn of event where there was a bone marrow registry that had found a way to suck money out of the whole bone marrow donor system in a way that was very unconscionable and incredibly lucrative. So we worked hard to shine a light on that, and made, I hope, a little bit of a difference.
Well, I'm sure, yes, ethics are very important. The mere fact that we have to highlight that these days is kind of disconcerting. And I think we need to point out, because something's not necessarily illegal, it doesn't mean it's not unethical, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and there are plenty of ethics guidelines for Congress, for the executive branch, and you've got oversight bodies. But depending on what they find, it's not as though someone is going to go to jail, but they may end up leaving their position. So, yeah, sure, not illegal, but not necessarily on the up and up either, and not necessarily the kind of behavior that you like to see.
Right. I just remind me of a story. I think it was 2 weeks ago I was watching, or maybe a little more. Scott Pruitt from EPA was testifying for a congressional hearing, and they're questioning some of his travel, some of his expenses, and certainly one of the Republican congressmen kept asking him, but that's not illegal, right? As if to make the argument that not being illegal makes it appropriate. And that kind of bothers me, because it really muddies the issue as to what we should expect from our leaders.
Yeah, a totally fair topic of conversation, and I think it's good to say just because it's not illegal doesn't make it good.
Right. Doesn't make it ethical, and again, we have to hold people to different standards. Would you agree with that? That leaders may be something you and I may not expect from each other, but we can expect it from our congressional leaders and our elected leaders. Do you believe in a different standard for them?
That's an interesting question. I think that they are operating in a different context. I mean, when you're acting based on a public trust, then it's an area of activity where you need to mind your P's and Q's in ways that are different from, say, when you and I just have our personal dealings in our small lives. Although all of us, to a certain extent, have a kind of a public part of our lives where we should totally act responsibly, whether we're just walking down the street or, in my case, I have a lot of ethical obligations as a journalist to play it up the middle and to provide a public service.
Right, and I agree with that. It's one of the conversations we've had on this show before had to do with lying and its effect on society. And another conversation we've had with another journalist was where journalism plays in today's society, especially in the Trump era, dealing with Trump. But we talk a lot about the truth. And I agree. I think that we have to recognize that just by the mere fact that you report something, especially in the media today, which is so widespread, that gives you an inherent authority. Whether it's real or perceived, it gives you, being a journalist, inherent authority. And we tend to believe authority in this country. And you can really influence our opinions and our perceptions in many ways. So I do hold journalists to a higher standard than I would to someone I'm talking to because of the authority and the power you have over the masses.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people actually push back against their authority. If you take a look at the lack of trust in news organizations. I was just looking at numbers recently that only about, say, 27% of the public has a great deal or a lot of confidence in newspapers. That's not a high level of trust. And I think that one of the problems we have today, not just talking about journalism, but talking about public institutions across the board, that there is a problem of trust in our institutions. I can't speak absolutely categorically, but for many institutions over the decades, we've seen declining levels of trust. And that's just simply not a good thing that you want to see in a society. And by the way, it leaves us vulnerable to such things as fake news and people saying, well, you have your facts and I have mine.
Right.
That's not a good basis for making decisions in democracy.
Right. And so would you say maybe it's because we have more resources now to question and to find alternate sources of information as opposed to years ago where we sort of had to accept the written word? Are we more inquisitive? Or do you think has there been sort of a diminution in maybe the way journalists and other institutions view their responsibility to be honest and truthful?
Yeah, I actually tend to look at it as a pretty complicated stew of factors that have changed the situation. I think that for sure we have many more sources of information. Both we have more, we used to have just the local newspaper or sometimes newspapers, and we had the 3 broadcast networks. But now we've got cable news and we've got all of these online news sources. So there's been a lot of additional pipelines of news that people can tap into, and increasingly we see that people tap into selective silos of information. So if you lean conservative, you're definitely going to be looking at Fox News and relying on Fox News a lot more. If you lean very hard liberal, well, you're probably going to be watching MSNBC more. So we see those sorts of silos developing, and there's a lot of polling out there that shows an increasingly polarized society, and where we get our information tracks with that.
Right. And this is sort of a matter of, if you agree, we all want to hear what we want to hear. Is that why we go there?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the key problem, and that's actually the test for all of us. I mean, it is so easy to suck up information because it supports the way you think the world is. The real test of citizens in a democracy is, are you willing to take in information that doesn't fit with your view of the world, the way you think the world should be? That's the real test to see whether or not you've got an open mind, and that's a test for all of us.
Right. So if I'm an MSNBC watcher, I should every now and then turn on Fox and vice versa to make sure I'm getting the full spectrum, and then try to do on my own research, reconcile the two bits of information that don't match up, or the difference of interpretation of the facts.
Absolutely. Let me tell you a quick story about a disabled veteran living in San Antonio who called me out of the blue. And he does exactly that. He had never come across us before, but he was watching a report on Fox News about something, and he wondered, is that actually true? He went to the web, he discovered us, read my piece, and he said, I think that that's getting closer to that the actual state of affairs on that particular topic. And I called him back to thank him, and he and I had a wonderful conversation because he does exactly what you said. He watches Fox, he watches CNN, he watches MSNBC, he's getting more into searching on the web. This guy's an active citizen, and I think the more people who are like that veteran living in San Antonio, fantastic.
I agree. I would bet, though, that most of us are not willing to do that. I must say myself, I do it for the purpose of these shows and, the presentations I give to understand the facts, but I can't say I always watch other points of view, because sometimes I don't want to hear what I don't want to hear. So I think it's just a little bit of human nature out there.
Sure. And by the way, I actually don't really recommend that you go towards two extreme poles and sort of triangulate to get towards the middle. I think that there are a fair number of sources out there that if you know how to read them, you can get straight information. But I will say this, that it has in some way gotten more complicated, and here's why. I do not like the trend that will afflict otherwise perfectly fine news sources, and, whether it's Wall Street Journal or whether it's New York Times or Washington Post or LA Times, all the big ones, right? They very often will weave into their presentation, not a particular article, but alongside a particular article, a bit of analysis. Now, I, as a journalist, clearly can see the difference side by side. There's straight reporting, there's analysis. But I guarantee you, most people don't make that distinction, and so they take it in wholesale, and they can say, with, I would say, some legitimacy, hey, this news organization is biased. And I believe that that's actually a problem that news organizations have brought on themselves. And by the way, that's even more true when you take a look at cable news and they respond to something, they throw up a panel of people, and they've got a journalist in there, and they've got an analyst in there, and they've got a political operative in there. It's a mishmash, and how is anybody supposed to sort that out?
That brings up an interesting analogy I'm thinking of in my career. I was a police officer and an FBI agent for 24 years, and I think about the reports that we would write. And it really comes back to Dragnet, just the facts. And that reports right. that are going to go to a prosecutor or maybe open up to whomever through discovery, just the facts, no observation, no analysis. Like I think John was lying or John seemed uncomfortable at the time. There is a place for that in our conversation, maybe what we call memos to the file that are not discoverable. But just the facts to avoid giving the impression that we're deciding a case based on our opinion rather than facts. So if I'm understanding you correctly, do you feel that these articles should be devoid of these analysis, devoid of the reporter's opinion, report the facts, and then use the analysis maybe in another section of the newspaper or somewhere else, and not blend it with the report itself?
Yeah, and I think that that's always going to be a better approach. I will say that on the web, the Washington Post has a way of flagging analysis pieces versus straight reporting pieces. I think that it's important, even in the straight reporting pieces, to be very careful about the language and keep it as neutral as possible. And quite frankly, one of the challenges there is everyone wants to write in a way that keeps somebody reading. And so if you use a slightly loaded term, it's probably going to make your piece a little spicier, a little more enticing. That's a constant temptation, but I think it needs to be resisted.
Right. I'm more of a kind of just the facts guy. I don't read the paper much now. I'm on the computer almost 24/7, getting my news. But I remember when I did read the paper, I never liked the creative writing aspect of newspapers. They say, "Oh, I met this guy in this long hallway. We walked down there." I'm like, "Give me the facts. Don't give me the creativity." I just felt there was two different places for it, and I just like the facts myself. But
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Did you have something else on that?
No. I mean, I totally get it, and there's a place for narrative, but I think that particularly in these days, when we do have high levels of skepticism about all institutions, I think that we need to dial it down, and we need to say, hey, guess what? This might be a little more boring, but it's actually a better public service. And quite frankly, at Politifact, we work really hard to trim out any loaded language. And I've got to say, independent reviewers have found, when they've analyzed our stuff, that we're doing a pretty good job of keeping it clean and straight.
We talk about the facts. Before I forget this thought, I know recently there's some discussion that having to do with Michael Flynn and the FBI, and the fact that they said no one reported that the agents didn't think he was being dishonest in his body language or the way they perceived that. Do you remember reading that?
Maybe, vaguely.
Yeah, and it just struck a bell with me, a little off the topic, but this is why opinions don't come into it. I'm not a great believer that you can tell if someone's lying or telling the truth by their behavior. I think as FBI agents and experienced police officers, we could tell by a whole bunch of factors. That's just by experience. That's just by the nature of the work we do. But that's not the kind of thing I would want to see in a report, an FBI report. Like we think he was being honest, or we think he was lying based on he looked this way or his body language like this. Because irrespective of all the science and all the training, it is still not an exact methodology. It's not exact science. And that's exactly why I wouldn't want to see
It's not a science at all.
Yeah, and I'm not a great believer in it because, as I say, if we could train you in body language like we train witnesses, if we could train you to how to appear honest and how to appear likable, if we could train you to do that, what does that say about the validity of body language?
Right. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
right, and it's off the subject, but I'm just saying that's why I don't like these opinions in these things. I think it's great that we keep them out of there because your opinion can be based on what you believe to be true, but it's completely invalid in terms of making an opinion.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go back to why I called you. So the other day, Donald Trump was out there talking about spying in his organization, spying in the Trump campaign. And I came upon a piece that you wrote, and I was impressed by it. And I said, I've got to reach out to this guy. So thank you for accepting my invitation. I appreciate it. We talked.
Well, thanks for reading our stuff.
That's good. Oh, before I get into this, you work for Politifact now. Can you please explain to the audience what exactly Politifact is?
Yeah, I mean, Politifact is a project that grew out of a decent-sized Florida newspaper, Tampa Bay Times, and that was about 11 years ago. And it was simply based on the idea that, hey, political leaders should be held accountable for making accurate statements. It's called accountability journalism. And it was very simple, said, when people make statements of fact, not predictions about how wonderful the world's going to be or how terrible the world's going to be, not their opinions, but actual statements of fact. Let's go ahead and do the research and ask, hey, is it accurate? So we did this, and people loved it. And we've grown ever since. And it is seen as a public service, and a public service, by the way, that has become a model worldwide. There are now 149 active fact-checking organizations around the globe. It's just grown year after year. So we're hardworking journalists, and we play it straight up the middle. I know that a lot of people feel that we are biased, and we're always happy to answer those sorts of questions and challenges. But we're nerds. We work with data and factual reports. And then at the end, we come up with a rating that says, well, how accurate was this statement?
Yeah, can you expand upon that a little bit? You and I were speaking before the show about how you go about determining your rating and how you come up with your opinion. Can you expand upon that for the audience?
Sure. So for anyone who hasn't seen our stuff, we have something called the Truthometer. And we'll be the first ones in the world to say, yeah, it's a little bit of shtick, but it actually serves a good information function. So our Truthometer has different ratings. We go from true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, and then somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it has some serious implications, pants on fire. Now, that's a little bit of a joke in a way, but that is a statement that is so ridiculously wrong that the person speaking should have had every opportunity to know that the statement was wrong. And let me give you an example. When President Trump said that in the election that 3 to 5 million illegal votes were cast, there is zero evidence that we had that kind of voting fraud. And yet he said it repeatedly. But there is no evidence. That, for us, is a pants-on-fire claim about a very serious topic, I would add. So that's our rating system. Behind all of those ratings, you can find them on the web. We have our thumbnail descriptions as to what makes something mostly true versus mostly false, what makes it half true. What we do is we go through and do all the research. We work with spreadsheets. We work with real solid, hard data from independent sources. And we lay that out there for people. And then we come up with the rating. We understand that the rating can be a judgment call. We discuss that among ourselves. But we put it out there just so people who are moving through material quickly can say right at the beginning, oh, here's a statement from this political leader. How accurate was it? See it on the meter. And then we hope that they read the whole article, because we believe that if they see all of the facts laid out, most of the time people will agree. We know that sometimes people won't agree. That's life. That's good. That's all fine. But that's our approach.
Yeah, and I know that Politifact has a pretty good reputation. I've looked at myself amongst researchers and opposition researchers. Have you come under attack, at least in the last year or two, from any particular organizations for not being honest and fair?
Well, you say organizations. Generally,
other than people just maybe blogging. I mean, an organization, someone, a news outlet, an organization of significance.
Well, generally, we find that every place loves us except when they hate us, and it all depends on what our ratings are. I'll tell you that our work has been cited positively by Fox News individuals on occasion. But I will also say that there are people like Sean Hannity that hate us, think that we are completely disreputable and biased. We understand that. Sean Hannity is not, in my view, an unbiased reporter. He's got a particular perspective. So he's welcome to hold to that perspective, and in that light, we can see where he would not view us favorably. But that's something that we're willing to accept as if you will, the cost of sticking to our guns and our approach. So it's interesting to us that in Congress, we see both Republicans and Democrats citing our work when it serves their purpose.
When it serves their
purpose.
So
if that's a measure of, the overall credibility that we bring, there you've got it.
When someone like Sean Hannity attacks you, is it just a lot of blah, blah, or has he ever come out with specific facts to show that your pants on fire is actually a pants on fire? Has he ever been able to prove you wrong or just make accusations?
Well, I remember one time when we gave a pants on fire, I think it certainly gave a false, to Sean Hannity for him making a statement about the number of refugees being resettled in America. And he was talking about, in his interview, he was talking about refugees from places like Syria, directly in the heart of the Middle East, and if not exclusively Syria. And he used a ridiculously high number. And we noticed that that number corresponded with a satirical piece that had been getting play on the web. Mm-hmm. We called him out on it. And then he went and said, no, I was talking about refugees across the world from wherever they come from. Well, that hadn't been the topic of conversation when he used the number. But he found a way. And you could almost see the producers hunkering down and think, how can we possibly make this look right? Right. And they found a number. Uh-huh. So we've seen that kind of response, that kind of detail. I don't know for a fact that, that he spun it a particular way, but I certainly have my suspicions.
Right. Do you find, again, just based on your experience as a journalist, that many times we'll hear politicians say something just completely incorrect or just really off the wall, and they give them the chance to take it back, so make set the record straight, but they don't do that. They double down. No, I don't want to take it back. I don't want to repeat it. And then eventually, months and months will go by, and they'll very quietly say, maybe I made a mistake. Is that the right way to go, in your opinion, to double down, or you think they'd be better off they just said, I made a mistake, I didn't check my facts, or I spoke too soon? Well, what's your opinion on that, just as a veteran journalist?
I think we'd all be better off if we all just sort of dialed down the rhetoric. If we say something wrong, own up to it. We sometimes have people do that. For us, it's actually a mark of quality when a politician or a website retracts and corrects what they said based on our research. We do find that happening from time to time, and we think that's good because really what we're all into is we've got an information commons. Think about it as a park, right? You go into a park, you'd like to see some clean grass. You don't want to see plastic bags blowing around and gum wrappers over here. We all have a responsibility to keep the information commons clean. We're like the guys going around with the little pointed sticks picking up the gum wrappers. That's kind of what I see us doing. And we sure could use all the help that we can get. And one of the things to do is, like, if you're in a park and you see somebody drop a gum wrapper, you say, excuse me, and they say, my bad, and they pick up the gum wrapper. That's a great way to live, right? So there's an answer to your question. Yeah, right. People should do it.
And I don't really understand, it's in general life, the problem people have is saying, oops, I made a mistake, I'm wrong. We all make mistakes, we make a lot of them, and when someone comes to me, or sure when they come to you and they said, oops, I made a mistake, let me correct that, I think you have a lot more respect for them individually when they do that, rather than when they try to build upon the lie or try to manipulate the truth or backtrack, double down. What's wrong with just saying, I made a mistake? We all do it, and aren't we all pretty forgiving when someone says that?
Yeah, you hope, but politics is a funny thing, and there's very often not a lot of nuance in political communication. That's another problem of our day. Life's a lot more complicated than we all would like, but yes, in politics, there's a strong incentive to simplify. And so correcting a statement, pulling back from that fine rhetorical point you made, it just doesn't work too well in terms of political communication.
Right. Now, if you guys made a mistake, let's say you as a journalist made a mistake, wouldn't it be in your best interest to come out right away and just correct it without trying to fudge the facts? Right.
We do.
And,
no. It doesn't happen often. But if we overlook something, we didn't include something that we should have included, we own up to it, we do a correction, we do a retraction, we go through a number of steps, and we're very transparent about it, because credibility is truly the most important asset that we can wield.
Right. You know, I find the irony when Trump or any of his press office, Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Spicer before that, would nail some of these places. Oh, they had to retract something they said. This is terrible. I think this, again, it should be a sign of respect. You made a misstatement. You came out corrected. A whole lot better than trying to step over or ignore it. I don't think that's a sign of poor workmanship unless you constantly have to retract, but it's a sign of really watching your craft and making sure you are responsible to the public.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I mean, in terms of news organizations, I'm a real big supporter of actual tangible news organizations so that we can be held accountable. This is the problem with a lot of information that moves around on the web. Where did it come from? I mean, you take a look at any of the fake news articles that get shared on Facebook and that sort of thing. You take a look at the article and you see who's behind it. What are their sources? You won't find any of the markers of a valid news organization. And God help you if you ever want to try and reach out to them and talk to the organization itself. And so when you've got a Politifact, we have an address, we have an email address, we are here, people can call us and do. That's where you actually have tangible accountability, and I think that's a real good thing for trust and for our ability as any citizen to be able to judge, well, can I get in touch with a news organization and hold them accountable? That's a marker of whether or not it's a valid news organization.
Right. Very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm fairly active on social media. I make my commentaries via this show or other ways. And I'll get even some of my friends on Facebook say, hey, Tabman, look at this. Look at this article. How do you explain this? And I don't like to embarrass them, but I said, where'd you get this information from? This is totally bogus. And they go, oh, I didn't check. I didn't know. I just took it at face value, which is the problem. But let me ask you a question. Do you think it is up to Facebook and other social media platforms to try to find these sources of fake information and sort of block them or do something about it? Or is it up to us to be able to recognize that and then take appropriate steps, whether to ignore it or to answer to it?
Rephrase that question, please.
Do you find it's the responsibility of Facebook or other social platforms where fake news is posted? Is it their responsibility to ferret out fake news, or is it up more to the consumer to recognize when it's fake news and not rely upon it?
Well, it really is up to both, and fake news that on the Facebook agenda has gone up pretty high. Facebook works with fact checkers like us to, they've got a system based on Facebook users, but also algorithms at Facebook that flags potentially fake news posts, and we're very active in debunking those. I just did one yesterday. And then one of the nice results of all of that is that when a post is found by a fact-checking organization to be inaccurate, it is flagged, it's marked, and so the next person who sees that post will actually see that warning symbol. And they will be given options. They can go ahead and share it if they want, but they're given the opportunity to learn more. So Facebook has set up a system whereby fake news posts become a teachable moment, and that's a good thing. And it has led to, for each of those items that gets flagged, a substantial reduction. I think I've heard the number 80%, substantial reduction in the number of shares after just a few days. So that's a good thing. So Facebook has been working on it, but, it's something that all of us should take as our responsibility. But I think Facebook has been taking this more and more seriously and has taken some concrete steps.
No, they have. And actually, that process you just described to me sounds fairly responsible. It's one way of educating the public, but being careful not to cross the fine line of quashing free speech from somebody else.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I know I saw on Facebook today this article from an old, I think, Chicago Tribune where Al Capone is complaining about the Justice Department infiltrating his organization. Have you seen that?
No.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's fake news.
Okay, sure.
Pretty sure it's fake news.
I tend to think so.
Meant to be, and I think it was meant to be tongue-in-cheek, and it's already being passed around as an analogy to the Trump organization. Right. And in these last, the year or so since Trump has been in office, has the nature of your work changed? Because, let's just put it out there, he lies X amount of number of times per day, makes some outrageous claims like you just pointed out about the election fraud. Has your work changed? And then I want to get your opinion as to why do you think he puts out these extraordinary claims? So first, has your work changed any in terms of how you view your responsibility or how you're viewed out in the public? Because you must be more active now than with other presidents in previous administrations.
So I think that the biggest change, it affects us, but it affects all of us. The biggest change that I actually find most troubling is that the statement "facts matter" has taken on partisan or political overtones. How nuts is that? If, Jim Comey, he puts out a tweet and he says "facts matter." Well, everyone reads that in a particular way, and it is a statement that in a regular state of affairs, we would have always found that people would say, here are the facts, here are the spreadsheets, blah, 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 and everyone could talk about the numbers. And yes, you can look at a particular spreadsheet over another spreadsheet, and we understand that's legitimate debate. But now, even just to say that facts matter shows to what extent the vitriol has reached the point where it's not whether or not things are actually true, but whether they are presented in a strong, persuasive, convincing manner. That doesn't make them true, but it's on that basis that people are taking in information, and that's the biggest shift that we've seen. We've always said that words matter. We've always said that facts matter. Now that takes on more political overtones than they did in the past. I think that's just a tough commentary on society today.
Okay, fair enough. All right, now, as I said, I'm going to get to a topic which I think I started 20 minutes ago. But when I have such great, knowledgeable guests like you, I have to go off onto these tangents as they arise because I don't want to miss these important points. So we have here your article that started our contact. Informants, infiltration, and spying, some definitions in the FBI investigation of Team Trump. So Donald Trump says there was a spy in my campaign. Your thoughts on that?
There's no evidence yet that there was anyone who infiltrated his campaign. I'm going to also say that we like to, as journalists at Politifact, we like to have primary sources. In this case, so much of this information, if not all of this information, comes from secondary sources. You've got the New York Times and the Washington Post reporting things, and the Wall Street Journal. Now, they all agree with each other, and there's a very high probability that they are correct. But I just want to put it out there that we do not like relying on news articles that themselves are based very often on unnamed sources. So we never use unnamed sources. We do not. That's a matter of policy. So I just want to put that out there. However, given the consistency of the reporting from different news organizations, it does not look as though anyone was ever inserted into the Trump campaign. So what we did is we took a look at the FBI guidelines on how they define informant and infiltration and all of the procedures that need to be followed. And as a former FBI agent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And we just said to people, hey, let's not throw a bunch of words around take a look, judge for yourself. We brought in a number of legal experts, people who work at that intersection of FBI investigations and the law, and said, make sure we understand what we're reading here. And it is very clear. What we did have for sure is, not for sure, if you believe the news reports, is that there was a guy used by the FBI to have conversations with at least 3 people associated with the Trump campaign. From what we read, these conversations were not extensive, nor did apparently they yield anything, but how can we really tell? But that is someone on the outside querying people who have connections to the Trump campaign. That is not infiltration.
Right, and you made a point. Yes, I'm with the FBI. I could have spoken, given a monologue here, what all these terms mean. I could have had on one of my FBI colleagues who show up on the show now and then for clarification, but I didn't want to use them because we sound like we're one-sided, that we're biased, or we're trying to put a positive spin, which actually isn't true. I'm fairly critical of the FBI on these shows, as I'm going to be in a minute with you. But I wanted to get an opinion from someone on the outside, a journalist like yourself who has a good understanding and who's willing to, throw some shade at the FBI when necessary. And I think you'd feel comfortable criticizing the FBI if you felt what they were doing was wrong. Now, you kind of made a point here, I'm reading your article, and the difference between, what an informant does and versus spying. And do you want to just maybe clarify that a little bit as to what you wrote here?
Yeah, first of all, no hard definition of spying. It's not a technical term. Right. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But there is a difference between having someone have conversations and glean information, and that is fairly common. Everyone has agreed. Those people are called informants. An informant is anyone who is in a position to tell you something and they know that they are telling you, the FBI, information that might be of interest to you. This is not like the FBI interviewing somebody. That's different. It is somebody who understands that they have, maybe for a limited period of time, a kind of a partnership with the FBI. It's very intentional that they are gleaning this information, that they are having these conversations. It's also not terribly intrusive because they're on the outside of the organization.
Okay, now I'll just tell you, as you use informants as well. In the FBI, we always talk about the need for human intelligence. It's always the most accurate.
Yes.
And it's also the most timely and the most actionable. And the use of informants is simply that. It could be someone inside the organization, such as a mobster. The drug cartels. We use people inside there to act as an informant, tell us what's going on. Now, when we think of a spy, obviously we think of espionage. We think of the Russians and the Chinese coming over here, our CIA out there. But we have corporate espionage. So if I was a reporter, if I worked for one sort of news outlet, and I got another reporter hired into your firm just for the purpose of being able to scoop your scoops first, of having them calling us, tell us what you're working on, that would be spying. If we put someone into the Trump organization for the understanding of what they're doing, so the Clinton campaign would know what they're up to and get their inside information or their proprietary information or however you want to call it, that would be spying. As opposed to someone who says, I got information on what might be illegal and I want to share it with the FBI. Two completely different techniques and two completely different motivations on the part of the person in the middle.
Right, and you've got the motivation part is clearly what's at play in this whole debate about what was the FBI doing. Because if the FBI is trying to glean information about Russian interference with the election, all's fair game, right? They could put someone into a campaign organization to ferret out information, as long as the purpose is a correct purpose. But to ferret out information for political purposes, no way is that legal. And that, of course, is what has been suggested, and that's where the investigation is focused right now.
Exactly. And, right, as you said, if there's indication that the Russians are interfering with our election, it's illegal, and there's counterintelligence implications. The FBI has every right and obligation to investigate it and use an informant if appropriate. And as you pointed out, even if we were to get that kind of information, if you start reporting back sensitive information about the Trump campaign, I am pretty confident that we would have sort of a firewall set up to make sure that information is put somewhere else and not reported and not mixed in with the investigative file of the collusion, or alleged collusion, because for the same reason that we could have a lawyer as an informant, but it'd be a very high bar. There's a lot of rules. We can have a journalist as an informant. Again, a very high bar that has to be set. And there is a lot of supervision and oversight when we have those sensitive situations, the FBI. And we do set up these firewalls. Again, because for the same reason we can't have a lawyer reporting on attorney-client privileged communication, which may accidentally happen. So we have a lot of rules in place, again, because of these guidelines we have. And you mentioned these guidelines. Why do we have these guidelines? You want to comment on that, sort of the history of that, which you mentioned in your article?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, because there was abuse.
Right.
Right? I always like to say, behind every policy, there was a screw-up.
That's right.
And this was a big screw-up. And, yeah, I mean, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had the FBI infiltrating and investigating the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it was clearly done for political purposes. And it was all, people were engaged in their completely protected First Amendment right activities, freedom of assembly, et cetera, right? And they were being investigated. And that was an abuse. COINTELPRO
I was going to ask you if you're familiar with that. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when that came to light, the Attorney General at the time, I forget his name, said, we are coming up with guidelines so that we do not go off the rails again. And that's what has emerged in this operations manual that is online and we link to, that people can read. So they have a sense of how does the FBI look at these situations today. It's because of abuses in the past.
Right, and let me point out, COINTELPRO, that agents were held personally liable in these lawsuits for the COINTELPRO activities. And even at the time of my retirement, which was 2007, that issue still arose. The fear of a COINTELPRO revisited still was reverberating in the FBI whenever we talked about these possible abuses. So if nothing else, fear is a big motivator. And nobody wants to go down that road again. So not saying that the FBI doesn't make mistakes in their judgment. They clearly do, and we can see that in most recent times. And there are always bad agents going to be there, and we try to ferret them out. But there is a lot of reasons. We have a lot of rules, and most agents want to comply with that, if nothing else, with fear of being in trouble, because at times they will be held personally liable if they overstep the bounds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, going back to this thing about informants, this morning I was watching the news as I always do, and Representative Peter King was on, and again, he brought up the dossier and having to do with the FISA. And he brought up the issue of it was completely invalid because the dossier relied on opposition research. You have informants in your business. Usually are those informants someone who's supporting the person you're targeting or has some grudge, something they want to give up? Isn't it usually the latter?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, we at Politifact use no unnamed sources. We are not an investigative newsroom. Maybe you could say we do many investigations, but not. We're not relying on informants that way. So it is the nature of political activity that there are people with inside information who will share it with journalists And journalists are well aware that when that information is shared, it is shared for a political reason. That doesn't make the information wrong. It could be accurate. It is certainly going to be incomplete. Smart journalists, responsible journalists understand that, and they don't rely strictly on that information. They go ahead and try to provide the context and learn more so that that little snippet that was presented to them, because it served a political purpose, is put into its proper framework. Yeah, it happens, but when you've got grown-ups and professionals, everyone understands what's going on, and hopefully acts appropriately.
All right, I'm going to ask your opinion only because, again, I saw it brought up in the news today, but I've had on the show someone who does opposition research. And what was mentioned is the fact that opposition research tends to at least seek the truth, because there's sending out rumors is one thing, but oppo research is designed to get facts that can be used against another opponent and not be debunked. So given that, and given the fact that you're someone who seeks the truth, you're someone who is, as a journalist, has used informants probably in your time, do you think, in your personal opinion, there's anything wrong with the FBI having used opposition research in part to obtain a wiretap for somebody? Is there something inherently wrong with that?
Well, you know, in the instance of the dossier, I think it's really important to recognize the timeline. The dossier is not what triggered the FBI to start its investigation.
It was loose lips. Loose lips started it, right?
Well, what triggered it was, yeah, if you want, you got George Papadopoulos saying to this Australian diplomat, hey, and he says this in May, I believe. Right. He says, hey, you know, I hear the Russians have got some emails that are embarrassing for the Clinton campaign. And then when you get DC leaks coming out in mid-July, and then WikiLeaks presenting that information at the end of the July, that is when the FBI connects the dots and says, let's open up this investigation. It wasn't the dossier.
Right, it wasn't. But even so, it was used. Apparently, there was a footnote there. So again, do you think there's anything inherently wrong with using that dossier, at least in part, as a reason for a wiretap over Pfizer or in the investigation itself? Do you see anything inherently wrong there?
I think that it's perfectly fine to use information if you put it into context and use it as a starting point. So I believe that the record shows, so far as anyone can judge right now, that the dossier was used in part, but it was not the driving factor. So now, that's my understanding from the outside. I do not profess to have total inside information, but
I just
that's
want your
certainly
opinion.
what we see right now.
Yeah. Again, information is information. The fact that it comes from someone with an ulterior motive doesn't necessarily mean it's false information.
No, it doesn't.
Now, you say you don't use unnamed sources. Is that strictly so you could not be accused of lying or making up information?
We do it for reasons of transparency. We think transparency breeds trust.
Right. So if someone comes to you with information and said, I call you up, say, John, I got this information, but I don't want my name used, will you take the information and then try to do like the FBI does, a parallel investigation, try to dig it up yourself, or how would you do that?
Yeah, it's not that dramatic for us as fact checkers generally. We certainly have people sharing information with us on background, and we don't use that information. We don't present that information. But sure, if it tells us where to go and document exactly what's going on, that's fair game. If we end up, bringing up some sort of, spreadsheet from Health and Human Services that's a public document, but we were pointed to that by someone, that's fine. There's no problem, as long as the information itself is valid.
Okay. Again, as you know, in the FBI and law enforcement, we have to protect our sources, even through trial sometimes. We use a confidential source, and depending how a judge rules, usually we're able to protect it as long as we could show some evidence that the source is reliable. But your colleagues in different outlets, news outlets, have to protect their sources. Do you think there's anything wrong with them reporting on information where they say an unnamed source? Is that inherently irresponsible, or is that just something that they need to do?
Well, the short answer is we don't do it. It clearly is done. It's not necessarily unethical to do it. And I guess when push comes to shove at the extreme, I'd say, yeah, okay, fine. I'm not happy with it. I'm not. So perhaps my take on it is I view any article based on unnamed sources as something to be questioned. Not necessarily something that's wrong, but something to be questioned. That's my approach. By the way, we're going to have to wrap this up.
Yes.
So let's go with a couple more questions.
All right, Wes, we are up the hour. So let's go on to the last thing. I read an article here again that you wrote, had to do with Politifact. Can Robert Mueller subpoena Donald Trump? A look at the legal precedents. What was your opinion on that?
Not my opinion.
Okay.
We
your
certainly,
research, what did your research tell you?
we certainly,
Okay.
yeah, no, we beat the bushes to get some wide range of legal opinions on this. In general, if you take a look at a key defining case involving the Nixon tapes during the Watergate investigation, yes, if an investigator in the official capacity has a specific need for specific information, it can be subpoenaed. And there is some legal dispute about can you require the president to sit down for an interview. We have not crossed that threshold yet in terms of a clear court finding on that. But the general presumption is if there is a specific need for information that can't be obtained another way, then say the special counsel could make a strong case. We don't have a definitive ruling on that yet. I would say that the general opinion is if it's a specific request, not a fishing expedition, then it's more likely to hold up under scrutiny.
Okay, and I appreciate that comment. And, it's just to wrap it up, what concerns me is what you and I are discussing. We've had other conversations discussing, can the president be subpoenaed? Is this spying versus informant? We're talking about everything but what is the truth and how are we going to get to the truth. And that bothers me because it seems like the truth now is taking second stage or, not quite as important as all this other minutia that we're talking about. Do you feel the truth is being blurred and it's not really become a priority because of all these distractions?
Well, like I said, I think that the pursuit of truth has become politicized. And that's not a good thing. I actually think that today we have more people concerned about discovering the truth than we did before because we've had bigger lies presented than in the past. So if there's a silver lining to where we find ourselves today, we can point objectively to information that says more people are alerted to the need to discriminate between accurate and inaccurate information. The number of people who come to our website has gone up dramatically. And part of that may be partisan, but a significant chunk of that is from people who say, I simply want to get a straight presentation of information. So there's your silver lining. More people are focused on the need for objective facts. Facts are not Democratic. They're not Republican. They are facts. And I would say that more people in America today are alerted to the need to make that distinction.
John, a silver lining is a perfect place to end this conversation. Let's keep it on an upbeat note. Thank you so much for taking your time. I know you're on a tight schedule. I really appreciate you fitting us in. That was some great insight, and I'm sure we're all going to appreciate thinking about what you had to say. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I appreciated the opportunity. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is Crimes and Times. Please go to YouTube and become a subscriber. Like us on Facebook, and continue to send in your requests for the type of shows you would like and suggestions. And we look forward to speaking with you next week. I'm Michael Tabman for Crimes and Times. Good night.